In this second video on the history of American books and literature, we'll focus more on the 19th century, the 1800s. Anyway, as they created their new government, many Americans wanted to distinguish the country from its colonial past. In 1785, Noah Webster published his famous A Grammatical Institute of the English Language. In essence, it's his first dictionary, and that documented American English, which he considered essential for independence in the new nation. And so you think of the Webster's Dictionary, it goes back that far. Likewise, in 1789, Christopher Cole published A Survey of the Roads of the United States of America, which he saw as a way to unify the new country. Cole's work constituted the first guidebook and roadmap of the new country. The new government wanted to ensure that its legislators had the most up-to-date information and research, and so they created in 1800 the Library of Congress. And I've mentioned already that Jefferson donated his personal library for its creation. Of course, the Library of Congress has copies of everything published today and is probably the foremost library in the world. The formation of this republic, which was so different than Europe, attracted a lot of Europeans. They were interested in it. And one of them was the French nobleman Alexis de Tocqueville. And Tocqueville and a colleague came to the United States in the early 1800s and traveled widely, ultimately publishing their impressions of the new country in a very famous book. This book was called Democracy in America, and it stressed a number of themes that sort of defined America. The unpretentiousness, the equality of people, the religious nature of the people. It was just different than Europe, the vast expanses and the independence of the people. And this is a classic still in publication today. The invention of the steam-powered rotary press in the United States in 1843 and the later addition of rolled paper dramatically increased the ability of printers to publish newspapers and books. You know, the old movable type press that ought to be manually done. Here we let the steam power do it, and rolling paper means it could flow quicker, and you could really just publish a lot of things quicker. Steam power, of course, was applied to more than simply publishing and helped contribute to the rise of the early Industrial Revolution, which transformed America throughout the 19th century, the 1800s. While it dramatically expanded the economy and the nation prospered, there were downsides as well. One such downside was increasing nativism, which exploded as increased numbers of immigrants arrived. Most notably, the Irish Catholics were arriving in great numbers, and they were depicted as ugly and drunk in numerous books and publications. Most notably, the inventor of the so-called Morse code, Samuel Morse, published the famous book, A Foreign Conspiracy Against the Liberties of the United States. Morse published the book first as a series of essays under the pseudonym Brutus, but everyone knew the true author, whose fame undoubtedly helped the book's popularity. He was famous because of his telegraph invention. Published in 1835, A Foreign Conspiracy Against the Liberties of the United States almost immediately went into a second edition. Despite his obvious contributions to the country with his telegraph and his Morse code, his vicious book really increased nativism. Another prominent nativist writer was Lyman Beecher. He was a president of the powerful Lane Seminary in Cincinnati, Ohio, and he wrote a pamphlet called A Plea for the West. Beecher noted that Catholic parents sent their children to parochial schools, Catholic-run schools, which undermined the American New England tradition of free public education. They were, Beecher said, teaching their children to dominate the new state governments that would form out of the growing Western territory. And so he thought the Western movement of people, the Protestants, should organize against this. As industrialization spread in the antebellum age, a period before the Civil War, there were other downsides. Factory work meant long hours, little wages, and unsafe conditions. People lived in crowded cities, increasingly polluted. Factory work was also a bit dehumanizing, as people felt not only powerless, but you're kind of like part of a machine. You're not individually important. The process continued to grow into the late 19th century, but it had gotten bad enough even before the Civil War in the antebellum age that it contributed to reform movements, and, in the process, one of the most productive periods in American literary history. The early Industrial Revolution, for example, contributed to the rise of Romanticism and Transcendentalism. They stressed the need for individuals to rise above or transcend the world mankind had created. Behind the world available to the senses was another idealistic reality. People could grasp this ideal only through mysterious intuitive powers in moments of inspiration. In this respect, nature was key. Here one can move beyond man's mundane creations and grasp the divine. Ralph Waldo Emerson was one of the most famous transcendentalist writers. A lecturer and essayist more than a writer of books, Emerson published the journal The Dial and, in one famous address, encouraged Americans to have literary independence from Europe, developing its own writing styles and conventions. The most famous of the transcendental writers was Henry David Thoreau. Thoreau produced over 20 volumes and had a poetic sensibility and an attention to detail that matched his subject matter. Thoreau decided to take Emerson's notion of solitude in nature quite literally. He built a cabin at the edge of Walden Pond near Concord, Massachusetts, and lived there from 1845 to 1847. And he wrote Walden, or Life in the Woods, which is probably his most famous book. It was first published in 1854. He became famous as his quest for sort of a spiritual meaning. You know, he said that he had to get past the trappings of what he called civilized society. You know, his book was a story of practical self-reliance, and, you know, but it really stressed, again, the idea of solitude and meditation and God and nature, and it's really sort of a famous text today. It's sort of, he's kind of a cultural hero for loners ever since, a counterculture hero even today. Another writer who glorified individualism in the face of the Industrial Revolution was Walt Whitman. He was a poet who most famously wrote Leaves of Grass that was first published in 1855. Whitman constantly sought to push established boundaries in poetry, and he did this not only in his form of writing, very individualistic, breaking conventional boundaries, sort of, frustrating every poet of the day, but he did it in his content as well. He praised everything from, quote, loafing in nature to, quote, observing a spear of summer grass. He even praised sex, which at the time was kind of considered outrageous and was quite dangerous. A number of fiction writers also stress individualism, maybe not quite as much as the more transcendentalist-like writers that I've mentioned, but certainly as in a reaction to the early Industrial Revolution. We'll start with Washington Irving, who in his sketchbook wrote of a character known as Rip Van Winkle. And Rip Van Winkle was a man imprisoned by his own life. You know, he had a domineering wife, he had burdensome family obligations and financial worries, and his life just basically sucked. Well, Rip met the ghost of Henry Hudson's crew, who drove him into a 20-year sleep. And when he woke, he was transcended from his old life. You know, his domineering wife was gone. His financial obligations had evaporated. He was free just to idle around the village spinning yarns. He was free from all the obligations of society. He had transcended his earlier life. James Finnemore Cooper is also famous. He wrote in 1826 Last of the Mohicans, and he followed it up in 1841 with The Deer Slayer. And the central ingredient in all of his books was kind of a character who was a loner, who loved the solitude of nature. His probably most famous character, Hawkeye, in The Last of the Mohicans, was a white man who had been raised by the Indians, and basically he wasn't really Indian and he wasn't really white either. He was caught between the two societies and was therefore kind of a loner. He transcended both societies. Now, other American writers of the period also stressed individualism, but they did it from a different perspective. They didn't praise it, but rejected individualism. They didn't see it in a positive way. They rejected the central praise of the transcendentalist and focused instead on the darker side of human nature, the excesses, the vanities, the corruption, and so forth. They often stressed that ego could destroy people and society. Now, one of the best examples of this was Nathaniel Hawthorne, who famously published The Scarlet Letter in 1850. That book concerns two people who challenged 17th century Puritan New England community. They committed adultery, producing a child, but they refused to bend to society's condemnation. The book isn't exulting in all of this, but it's rather a tragedy. There's guilt and anger which consumes them. The guy dies and the lady spends her life doing penance by serving the community. To Hawthorne, the real crime was pride, flouting their individualism at the expense of the community. And the Scarlet Letter has been made into a number of movies. Most famously, it was made into a movie starring Demi Moore, and you can see that down at the bottom. Another writer that stressed individualism and kind of from a negative standpoint was Herman Melville, who famously published his novel Moby Dick. And Moby Dick's a story of a whaling captain named Ahab who is chasing this whale named Moby Dick. And Ahab becomes consumed, it dominates his life, and it bothers him and consumes him so much, and you kind of get the feel that Ahab has become the prey, and it kind of casts individualism as so extreme that it's almost negative. The problems of the Industrial Revolution led not only to writers stressing transcendentalism or individualism from various perspectives, but also even spawned new religions. And in this regard, there's Joseph Smith, who published divinely inspired revelations in 1830 that became known as the Book of Mormon. God called Smith to lead a revival of his church, stressing community and biblical personal behavior, which appeared threatened by many of the cultural changes attendant to the Industrial Revolution. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, commonly known as the Mormons, grew from Smith and this published book. As the early Industrial Revolution swept across much of antebellum America, the role of women began to change. Before, women were almost universally confined to being a wife or mother, but increasingly some women began to advocate for a broader role in American life. Some spoke of women working in the sort of quote-unquote woman's sphere. Now that was outside the home, but still in professions that utilized perceived female virtues, in areas, for example, such as education. Catherine Beecher was a strong advocate of women working in education, and in 1841 published her book Treatise on Domestic Economy. The book encouraged women to become teachers, and in time, of course, females dominated almost all of early education. Other women, considered even more radical, pushed the idea of greater female equality. Margaret Fuller published a series of essays in Emerson's journal The Dial in 1843, which proved both popular and controversial, and later were expanded into a book in 1845 entitled Woman in the 19th Century. Fuller's book contributed to the growing movement for women's rights, exhibited at the time by the famous Seneca Falls Convention in 1848, which declared men and women equal, a truly radical concept. Perhaps one of the most controversial books of the antebellum age was Charles Darwin's On the Origins of Species, published in 1859. The book quickly sold out and sparked considerable debate in the scientific community, transforming science forever. In America, which in the antebellum age was contending with the spread of slavery, Darwin's book had special relevance. For some, Darwin's book spoke to the common humanity in both African Americans and whites, which moved some against slavery. For others, however, it suggested that while African Americans were from the same proverbial tree as whites, they had not advanced through natural selection to the same degree. For them, it gave an intellectual foundation for the differences in race, and thus a basis for separate treatment and slavery. Of course, in the antebellum age, literature reflected the debate over slavery. Most notably, a number of books were published that reflected and grew abolitionism. As early as 1829, the free black David Walker published his famous Appeal to the Colored Citizens. It ridiculed slave owners and justified slave rebellions. Quote, "We must and shall be free in spite of you," it declared to whites. The book went through 3 printings, and as southern states tried to ban it, abolitionists still smuggled it in. One abolitionist and women's rights advocate was the freed slave Sojourner Truth. In 1850, she published The Narrative of Sojourner Truth, which recounted her life as a slave, her freedom, and her drive for an end to slavery. Like Walker's book, it helped grow abolitionism. Not all of these abolitionists were African American. There were white abolitionists, including Theodore Dwight Weld. Weld, who was a minister, wrote his famous The Bible Against Slavery, and it went through the Bible and it made the argument that you know the Christian church should be against slavery. The Bible stresses love and equality, and of course, the Bible is also being used by slave owners at the same time to justify slavery, just highlighting other sections of the Bible. Then Weld published the book American Slavery as It Is, Testimony of 1,000 Witnesses. It was sort of like an oral history, and I wasn't trying to be objective, but it was, a compilation of the horrible treatment of African Americans in slavery, and both these books were bestsellers and, again, helped contribute to the rise of abolitionism. Of course, one of the greatest books that helped spread the abolitionism was Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin. It was a novel, but in Harriet Beecher Stowe actually had never been to the South, but it was a novel about slavery and its treatment. It was a bestseller as fiction, and even though people took its depiction of slavery to be accurate, and really angered a lot of people about the institution. After the Civil War, of course, the United States was settling the West and the Great Plains, and you might think of this period in the late 19th century as being when the cowboys and Indians were fighting. Well, throughout this period, people looked upon the Indians as sort of savages. They they weren't really civilized. They didn't deserve the land, and the white people were right to take it. Well, by the late 19th century, there's going to be a book by Helen Hunt Jackson called A Century of Dishonor that's going to change the narrative and get people thinking about the way they've treated Indians. A Century of Dishonor, someone's acting dishonorably, and it sure as heck wasn't the Indians. You see, in her view, the Indians were just defending their land, and they were happy with their style of living, and the white man came in and made promises it didn't keep, and so the white man had acted dishonorably. And this is going to transform the way Americans treated the Indians. It's going to lead to reform legislation to try to help the Indians. Specifically, Helen Hunt Jackson's A Century of Dishonor led to the Dawes Severalty Act of 1887, which broke up the reservations and stopped recognizing Indian nations, the idea being that we divide the land into individual plots and use the proceeds from sales to build schools to acculturate the Native Americans. In reality, the sales weren't fair, and eventually this law was repealed and the United States re-recognized separate Indian nations. But in the interim, the Native American children were rounded up and dressed as whites and taught white history, reading the white books, and it really helped. This Dawes Severalty Act really sought to help quash Native American culture. Looking back at America's past, Frederick Jackson Turner, who was an historian, published in 1893 his famous The Frontier in American History. What Turner said was a wild, uncharted frontier was important to the development of America. And, it created an independent spirit. It provided raw materials, and it kind of siphoned off from the East discontented elements that might otherwise cause revolution. Now, this thesis, this Turnerian thesis, a frontier in American history, worried many Americans who feared that with the Western frontier closing in the late 19th century, the United States would suffer in the future. And so Turner's Frontier in American History, that book was a bestseller. After the Civil War, as the West developed in the late 19th century, Americans began to develop more of a romantic view of the historic Western frontier, the Wild West, cowboys and Indians fighting. So-called dime novels romanticizing the frontier became popular at the time. Cheap but hardly great literature. Most famous were the 33 Deadwood Dick novels by the author Edward Wheeler. The good cowboy would wear a white hat and ride a white horse, and the bad cowboy would wear a black hat and ride a black horse, and there'd be gunfights and excitement. Of course, this romanticized Wild West image of the resilient cowboy living by his wits and his six-shooter, sort of a man's man, lives today. If you don't believe me, just look at all the westerns that are in television or in movies. We even name our sports teams after, cowboys the Dallas Cowboys, for example. Look at the popularity of Western wear. We still have this romanticized vision of the 19th century American West that got started with these dime novels. By the end of the 19th century, the Industrial Revolution was near its peak, with its consolidation of wealth and abstract poverty obvious. This sparked a number of authors to debate the proper role of government. Should the government or should not the government help this? One of the early forerunners of sociology, Herbert Spencer, published a great volume of books, but is probably most famous for his Social Statics. It was published as early as the 1850s and has been published in many editions afterwards. In it, Spencer talks of applying Darwinian evolution principles to society, and in doing so, helped popularize the idea of what we call social Darwinism. Spencer, in fact, didn't advocate social Darwinism, but when you think of social statics and Spencer, most people tend to think of social Darwinism, which was used to justify the government not helping out these poor people. Social Darwinism, people took after reading Spencer's book. If the wealthy went in and helped the poor out, it would perpetuate the traits that were disadvantageous to society. The poor people would reproduce more, and it hurt society in the long run. Better just have a little tough love and let them weed out. So again, it was a justification for doing nothing. The opposite view for getting government to help the poor was kind of summarized in a book called The Gospel of Wealth, which was published by the steel magnate Andrew Carnegie in 1889, and it was an answer to the social Darwinist. What Carnegie said was that the rich people have a moral obligation to give some back. If you made a lot of money, you should help out the poor. It's more of a religious thing, hence the term Gospel of Wealth. Of course, writing in England in the late 19th century during the Industrial Revolution was, of course, Karl Marx. And he wrote Das Kapital and the Communist Manifesto. And what he says is, hey, nobody's going to help these poor people. And there are a lot of these poor people. And they're going to rise up and they're going to seize the property and share the wealth and get rid of government. And it's going to be this utopian communist society. And so Marx's books are starting to be read among the poor people. And that was obviously worrisome for a lot of people. But in any event, this whole Industrial Revolution and the disparity of wealth caused a great deal of debate in American literature. In any event, this concludes the section on the history of American literature and books during the 19th century.